La liberté d'expression est une condition centrale pour l'exploration et l'échange d'idées et pour la tenue de véritables discussions et de débats productifs. Pourtant, elle est elle-même un sujet de débat, étant donné que beaucoup pensent qu'elle devrait être limitée afin d'éviter les offenses ou la diffusion d'idées haineuses. En Europe, les 30 dernières années ont vu des auteurs, des cinéastes et des dessinateurs se faire attaquer et parfois tuer, avec pour cause le caractère perçu comme offensant de leurs travaux envers une religion en particulier. Pire, une partie substantielle du public est de l'opinion que, si cette violence est injustifiée, ceux qui offensent les croyants devraient probablement être punis par la loi. Une plus petite partie du public a même ouvertement affirmé qu'elle était favorable à la violence dans ce cadre. Le royaume du Danemark s'est retrouvé au centre de ces problématiques, notamment avec la publication au milieu des années 2000 de caricatures de la figure humaine principale de la religion islamique, dans le journal Jyllands-Posten. Mon invité dans cet épisode, Jacob Mchangama, a grandi au Danemark et a beaucoup écrit sur le droit à la libre expression et sur les offensives que celui-ci a subies de la part de théocrates brandissant des armes à feu, mais aussi de responsables gouvernementaux au niveau national et international. Freedom of speech is a key condition for people to explore and exchange ideas and have real discussions and productive debates. Yet it is itself a subject of debate, as many think that it should be curbed to avoid offense or to avoid the spread of hateful ideas. In Europe, the last 30 years have seen authors, filmmakers and cartoonists attacked and even sometimes killed for the perceived offensiveness of their work to one religion in particular. What is perhaps even worse is that there was a substantial section of the public that opined that, although this violence is never justified, those who give offense to believers should probably be punished by the law. A smaller portion of the public has even voiced its support for violence in these conditions. The Kingdom of Denmark has been at the center of these issues, especially with the publication in the mid-noughties of caricatures of the main human figure of the Islamic religion in the Jyllands-Posten newspaper. My guest today, Jacob Mchangama, hails from Denmark and has written a lot about the right to free expression and how it has come under attack both by theocratic gunmen and by government officials at the national and international level. Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Jacob Mchangama. Welcome to the podcast, Jacob.
Thank you very much.
So you're a lawyer and a human rights expert, and you're an assistant professor in international human rights at the University of Copenhagen from 2005 to 2007, and an adjunct professor there from 2012. And you also founded Justitia, a Danish think tank focusing on human rights and the rule of law.
Indeed.
Your writing has been featured in such publications as the National Review, Foreign Affairs, as well as the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and of course Danish newspapers. You were also awarded the Venstre Party's Freedom Prize in 2013, and you very recently launched a podcast called Clear and Present Danger, where you will explore the history of free speech. So what got you interested in the first place in these issues of human rights and in particular free expression?
Well, human rights, I guess, was something that I found in my university years that I found was very interesting. Maybe also because I have a father who he's from the Comoro Islands, a former French colony, and was imprisoned there both by the French and later on when he fought for democracy. When under independence it was an autocracy. So maybe it's through that. But my interest in free speech, I think I didn't think so much about free speech because I grew up in a country where you could take free speech for granted. And when I was in my youth, the expectation of my generation was really that free speech would become a universally entrenched principle, freedom.
So that country was Denmark. Forgive me for interrupting. Just to clarify.
that country was Denmark, which is sort of one of the most liberal countries in the world, still is. But of course, then we had the whole cartoon affair in Denmark, and suddenly Denmark, this small country, became the epicenter of really a global battle of values over the limits of free speech. And I have to say, I was a bit struck by the debate that unfolded because numerous people who lived off free speech, journalists, reporters, others who had grown up in a secular liberal democracy suddenly started arguing that you had to be careful about offending religious feelings, while at the same time people were living with death threats and there were terrorist threats against writers. But then in the subsequent decade, I saw another development that many of those who had really defended free speech during the cartoon affair started sort of backtracking on their defense of free speech, suddenly arguing that that maybe free speech shouldn't be protected so much when it came to certain Muslims or Islamists whose expressions they found were not sufficiently democratic or not sufficiently patriotic, and so I started thinking about free speech as a principle and why it seems so incredibly difficult for human beings to take free speech seriously, and everyone tends to prefer promoting free speech when it suits their agendas, and to butt out, if I may say so, whenever free speech is advanced by their ideological opponents.
Yeah, it was the title of the book. I haven't read it yet, but maybe I should. The book by Nat Henthoff, Free Speech for Me, but not for
Yes,
thee.
exactly. And so this is also the reason why I'm doing Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, is really to explore the concept of free speech, because I find that a lot of the discussions on free speech tend to be rather superficial. And this includes a lot of my own writings also, that it tends to be sort of sloganeering rather than really exploring, what is this principle? When was it developed? Why was it developed? How was it developed? Who has it benefited? And also, how has free speech been relevant for some of the values that modern democracies have secured, or at least aspire to? Equality of the sexes, empowerment of minorities, democratic ideals, and so on. So this is really why you could say I have been so obsessed with freedom of expression over the past 10, 12 years, and have spent a lot of hours reading and writing about it.
Mm-hmm. So I remember coming across your work when reading about hate speech, as it is called these days, and the origin of hate speech laws.
Yes.
So you explained in a research paper for the Hoover Institution that the Soviet Union pushed hard to have hate speech laws introduced at the United Nations in order to limit dissent and criticism of the Soviet regime and its allies. And you wrote further that, and here I will quote you, the voting record reveals the startling fact that the internationalization of hate speech prohibitions in human rights law owes its existence to a number of states where both criticisms of the prevalent totalitarian ideology as well as advocacy for democracy was strictly prohibited.
Exactly.
Yeah, could you describe this history in more detail of how regimes that were heading non-free countries pushed for so-called hate speech laws at the UN?
Yes, it's important to stress that it's not as if all the Western countries at the time were in favor of sort of First Amendment freedom of expression of the type that it is protected here in the United States, where I am currently. But these states the liberal democracies of the time saw clearly that if you are to internationalize human rights across all cultures, it becomes extremely dangerous if you have an obligation in a human rights convention to prohibit hate speech, because the definitions of what will constitute hate speech will be very different from country to country, and particularly when you had, as you had at the time, a number of communist states which actually had legislation in place where criticism of the party, of the ideology, was labeled as hate speech or as hateful sometimes. This would provide a powerful legitimacy, you could say, of the repression of dissidents. And sure enough, if you go back and look into some of the files of the socialist states on a dissident like Sakharov like Sakharov or Václav Havel, for instance, you will see that these secret police and the communist parties used language like hatred when charging these dissidents.
So how was hatred sort of defined in this case? What were the Soviet dissidents supposed to be hating?
So basically, I don't have the wording in front of me, but if you had sort of hatred against the state ideology or the country as such, and then the country tended to be quite the same as the political party, then that could be a form of hate speech under the laws of the time. And this is, of course, not something that was aided by including a prohibition against hate speech in a human rights convention. And in fact, the first draft of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was an American draft, I believe, which did not include the current Article 20, where you find the obligation to prohibit hate speech. And of course, recently, in the last 10 years, it's mostly been the OIC, so the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that have tried to expand the wording of Article 20 to include what we in many countries would say blasphemy, would call blasphemy, to say, well, religious hatred really should mean the same as blasphemy. So basically, criticism of religion should constitute hate speech. So that's another reason why it was unfortunate that a prohibition against hate speech was included in international human rights law. Because it's one thing to have, one country having a ban on hate speech. You could say Germany has had its past, and so they feel a need to have a ban against totalitarian symbols, Holocaust denial, and so on. I don't think it's a good model, but you can understand why you can understand the historical reasons why it's in place. But once you try to internationalize it, it becomes dangerous, particularly in liberal states.
So this is at the international level, and it is also the case that at the national level, so you just gave the example of Germany, actually, as I am currently myself. Some countries also, many countries, if not almost all of them, also have their own versions of hate speech laws, and of course, people who think that free speech should be limited rather strictly usually argue that hate speech is not free speech, and this very much begs the question, and this is a question that you briefly raised before, of what exactly, how exactly one would define hate speech in this case. So what is the current sort of I mean, how do people define it in various countries at this
Well,
stage?
that's a good question. Of course, at the European level, the European Court of Human Rights has long held that hate speech is not protected by free speech under the European Convention on Human Rights, as opposed to in the United States, where hate speech is generally protected by the First Amendment. Um, but if you go into the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, it doesn't give a particularly clear definition of what hate speech actually consists of. And I think you can find a number of cases from different countries that shows that it's rather arbitrary and difficult to define what actually constitutes hate speech. And often you will also see that what one camp argues should be as beyond the pale, then they are outraged when something that they are in favor of constitutes hate speech. So, for instance, if we go back to the whole debate over cartoons, blasphemy, Charlie Hebdo, then some have called for the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo to be banned as hate speech. But in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo, there were a number of Muslims in France who were convicted for glorification of terrorism, for for T-shirts or writing something on social media, and so this to me shows that it's whenever you advance limits on free speech to capture hate speech or extreme speech, you almost inevitably end up having a broader sweep than intended, and you have unintended consequences of such things. And the latest avenue is of course the question of fake news. Where in France, I understand that President Macron has said he will introduce a bill targeting fake news. And when you think about it, I mean, this is basically the same as Donald Trump wants to do in the U.S. Obviously, Donald Trump would like to go after the New York Times and CNN and others, whereas Macron wants to go after Russian state-owned media and maybe populist blogs and so on. But this just shows that when you introduce these things, it will always be the powers. It will always be the powers in B, the powers that be, that get to define what is fake news or hate or hate speech. So basically, you have to. I think whenever you advance such things, so if you're in the United States and you are worried about a certain group's use of speech, you should think, okay, do I want to advance limitations on free speech that say Donald Trump could use for his purposes, or if you're on the other side, someone in a Democratic president, whoever that will be in the future, and the same in Europe. I mean, you have to think, if you don't like populism, and if you're worried about anti-immigrant hate speech, do you want to advance laws that could be used when someone like Geert Wilders or Le Pen may or may not one day come into power, because they will then have these tools at their disposal, and you have basically yourself eradicated the defense of free speech, because you have argued against a principle protection of free speech. So I think those considerations are extremely important when you debate it. You shouldn't just say, oh, I don't like this person or that group, so I'm in favor of restricting free speech for them. You should think about the long-term consequences of eroding a principle that really has been fundamental for what we can call the liberal world order of the past 70 years or so.
Yeah, this is very much a classic argument in favor of free expression. Articulated by Christopher Hitchens, among others. Yeah, it's a compelling one, I would say.
And it really is as I have started studying the history of free speech. Right now, I'm close to finishing an episode that I call The Age of Persecution, which deals with the persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire. And then after the Roman Empire becomes Christian, adopts Christianity as a state religion, the persecution by Christians of pagans and other and non-Orthodox Christians. And it's quite a striking history, because you basically have a minority hated sect of Christians that is persecuted on off from its beginning, that grows strong and powerful, eventually takes over the very empire that executed its founder, and then becomes extremely intolerant itself. And I think that in there lies a lesson that when you're in a position of power, you want to think really hard about whether you want to persecute those who are of a different belief than yourselves, because you may not always be in power. I mean, when was the last time you went into a pagan temple and saw someone sacrificing to the Roman gods? I mean, paganism doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So I think it's not just a recent lesson; it's one that has very deep historical roots.
Mm-hmm. So one of the most recurrent arguments, seems to me at least, in favor of hate speech laws today is the idea according to which these laws are necessary to ensure harmonious coexistence in the ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse Western countries. Has there ever been any evidence that this is the case?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, it's of course a well-intentioned argument in favor of free speech, saying, look, we have welcomed a lot of people from other backgrounds, different ethnicities, cultures, and religions. In order to ensure that all of us can live together, we need to, we need to be more careful what we say about particular groups. But I would argue that really diversity. I mean, I'm very much in favor of diversity right now. I live in New York, which is a wonderfully diverse place. I enjoy that very much. But I would argue that diversity requires more freedom, especially when it comes to ideas and expressions. So the idea is basically either you respect everyone's taboos or you don't respect them. I mean, this, of course, does not mean that you should gratuitously seek to to offend or disparage everyone who doesn't think like you. It doesn't mean that when I go back into the subway, I start shouting profanities at everyone who looks different from me. But it means that inevitably, when you have different beliefs, philosophical, religious, political, they're going to clash. And I think free speech really is the antithesis of violence rather than the instigator of violence. It really allows human beings in complex, diverse societies to settle deeply held differences by peaceful means. If people agree that you don't have a right not to be offended, and you have a right to say what you want, provided that everyone else also has the same right. And so, I mean, so people who live together side by side in many countries in the world that formerly tried to exterminate each other. I mean, when was the last time you saw Catholics and Protestants in Europe really, outside Ireland? When was the last time you saw sort of really violent clashes between Protestants and Catholics? That is a rare, if not a completely forgotten issue, but it was once something that ravaged the European continent for centuries. And that very much has to do, I think, with the slow emergence of the realization that, either we try to exterminate each other or we accept that people live here with different beliefs, that, a tolerance, that a grudging tolerance that grew into religious freedom and then grew into the larger idea of freedom of expression as such, that you could not only deviate from the Orthodox faith, you could eventually even say, I'm not a believer at all. Um, and I think that is a very precious thing.
Yeah, there is this very famous line by the French poet and writer, Paul Valéry. So I can only paraphrase it from memory right now, but it goes something like, in the face of disagreement, there are only two ways for people to interact, and these are logic and war. And you seem to broadly agree with that.
Yeah, I think so. If I may go back into history as well, so the first real episode that I will release on the podcast deals with democracy in ancient Athens, and here again you see very clearly how something a radically egalitarian democracy for its time. I mean, obviously, slaves, foreigners, and women were excluded in the Athenian democracy, but compared to everywhere else, it was radically egalitarian, and they settled their differences by allowing everyone to speak and vote at the assembly, but they also allowed a very wide degree of parousia or uninhibited speech outside the assembly, so in everyday life. But there were two occasions where the Athenian democracy was overthrown by oligarchs who didn't want to share power with the poor, and on both occasions, what they did to overthrow democracy and to entrench sort of an oligarchic regime was to assassinate democratic leaders and to use violence to basically short circuit the democratic organs of the Athenian democracy. And so that to me is a very early, I mean, it's basically history's first confirmation, I would say, of the old saying that the first victim of tyranny is free speech.
Mm-hmm. So a recurring point of contention in these debates around free speech, and we've touched on this earlier in this interview, has been the publication of works of art, be they books, cartoons, or films, deemed to be offensive to Islam. The Western world became aware of that issue in February of 1989, of course, with the calls by Ayatollah Khomeini to kill Salman Rushdie. And it seems that we are still very much living in the wake of the Rushdie affair. How have the positions of Western governments evolved on these matters? So, for instance, you wrote that, and here I will quote again what the equivocating statements from Western leaders have done. So, meaning equivocation on the value of free speech and including religious offense. So what these equivocating statements have done is to leave an impression among citizens of Muslim societies that Western politicians are weak and ineffective, willing but unable to stop inflammatory expressions, instead of helping them understand that this is not the business of the state.
I think so. I mean, when you say in the wake of the murder of cartoonists, you say we have to stop extremism on both sides. I think I really think that's in many ways a shocking statement, because no matter how offended you may be by a cartoon, hardly extremism comparable to someone saying, I'm going to use an AK-47. So that kind of equivocation, I think, is quite dangerous. And again, I would say, if you go if you go back through history, you will see numerous examples of religious fundamentalists, whether pagans, Christians, or Muslims, who have used sort of mob violence to shut down their opponents. One of the most infamous examples, which still touches me when I read about it, was a female philosopher and mathematician in Alexandria in Egypt in 451 AD, Hypatia, and she was murdered, brutally murdered by a Christian mob of fundamentalists. So, would we today, when we read that story, would we go back and say, well, we got to stop the extremism of both sides? Why did Hypatia have to be so provocative towards the feelings of uh, of the Christians of Alexandria? Couldn't she just have toned it down a little bit? And to me, there's not a lot of difference between that and a cartoon or saying something critical of religion, whether that be Islam or Christianity or Judaism. Um, to me, a belief system it should not be treated differently from, I would say, a secular system of ideas. And everyone would laugh if someone advanced the idea that you should treat liberalism or communism or conservatism with respect, and you shouldn't offend the feelings of communists or libertarians or conservatives, who of course can be every bit as motivated, committed to their ideologies as religious believers can be.
Yeah, although it might be argued, I don't know if this is the case, but sometimes I might feel like not everyone might actually laugh in that political ideologies can also be held very dearly by people, so much so that they will be.
Yeah, of course, there have been those who have been killed. But I don't think if someone was to say hey, I'm a libertarian. I think you shouldn't criticize my belief, or I'm a communist. You shouldn't. Then no one would say yes. We have to respect your political feelings.
That is true, probably. So, with all of this in mind, you're in the process of launching this new podcast. So, I will repeat its name. It's Clear and Present Danger. And so, on this podcast, you're going to explore the history of free speech. So, well, of course, you've talked about it a little bit throughout the interview, but could you explain maybe in more details what exactly you want to achieve with this podcast? You said that you've noticed that usually debates around free speech might be a little bit caricatural and simplistic.
These debates, they'll, one proponents of free speech will say, it's extremely dangerous to limit free speech. Just think of Nazi Germany. And then the other side will say, no, it's dangerous to allow too much free speech. Just think of Nazi Germany. And then someone will say, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend, with my life your right to say it. And I think they quoted Voltaire when really it was his biographer, Beatrice Evelyn Hall. And then someone will say, you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater, repeating a line from U.S. Supreme Court justice used to justify the conviction of a socialist for opposing the draft with pamphlets. I mean, that's a caricature, but I think a lot of debates and writing on this stuff, and it also includes some of my own writing on these things, tend to be a bit too much sloganeering rather than having sort of the historical context and awareness. And I've certainly, through this process, I've changed the way that I look at human rights, the way of free speech, the way I look at free speech, the way I argue about it. I mean, I haven't come around to being in favor of inquisition and censorship, um, but I'd like to think that my thinking on the topic has become a bit more sophisticated, and I very much think that I'll continue to sort of change the way I think about this, and as I hopefully gain a deeper understanding, and of course the hope of the podcast that the listeners will also gain this, and also that they will. I mean, mine is a history of free speech. It is not the history of free speech. You know, you could have other perspectives on free speech, and there's obviously a lot of material that I cannot include that others, can use, and maybe they can use the podcast as a point of departure for their own journey in the history of free speech. If I succeed with that, I'll be very happy.
Mm. So if I understand correctly, the podcast will be centered on the results of your own research, right? It won't be an interview format, but rather you will be doing the talking.
There will be sort of the general episodes will be narrated by me, but I will also include a number of what I call expert opinions, where the real experts get to weigh in on some of the issues that we've dealt with. They can sort of go into more depth about things that I maybe only touched upon, or things that I didn't include in the episode. So generally, it'll be this voice that you will hear if you listen, but I will also include experts to get the expert opinions and break up the monotony of my voice a little bit.
I see.
Thank you.
Okay, well, good luck with that. It is certainly a very worthwhile project.
When you listen to it, if you like it, make sure to go and review it on iTunes.
Yes. Okay. I have one last question, which might take us back to, earlier themes. Themes that we discussed earlier in the interview, and going back to the United Nations. I can remind the listeners that the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by the United Nations, ensure that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. After what we briefly discussed and what you've talked about at length in your own writing, should we be confident that the United Nations is still, to be trusted to uphold this commitment?
That's a good question. I mean, if you look at the respect for at least press freedom, it's been in constant decline since 2004. I don't know that you can blame the United Nations for that. But I think if you look at depends on where you center in the United Nations. It's clear that if you look at the Human Rights Council, there are a number of member states in the Human Rights Council who use their position on the council to try to limit free speech. We saw that with the whole issue of defamation of religion. That dominated the UN for a number of years. But if you go to the Human Rights Committee, which is composed of independent experts, you will see that they have actually done quite important work on free speech. If you look at the independent expert, the special rapporteur on freedom of expression at the UN level, they have also. Many of them have also done a very good job on shining light on abuses of freedom of expression. So I would say that there are elements within the UN system that are pulling in the wrong direction, and there are those that are pulling in the right direction.
Okay, so one should distinguish between the Human Rights Council on the one hand and the Human Rights Committee on the other.
Yes, that would be a good starting point.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a very clear answer. I don't know if you want to add anything to what we've have been talking about? I've reached the end of my questions.
Nothing else, and it's been a pleasure to be on the show. So thank you very much, and remember to listen to Clear and Present Danger.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Jacob, and well, all the best for this very nice project.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.